This is another oral history interview with broadcasters in Jacksonville's history, and we're glad to have Deborah Gianoulis with us. So Deborah, people who have been in Jacksonville for a while will remember you from Channel 12 and mostly, I would say, Channel 4.
Absolutely.
But let's go back before those Jacksonville days. How did you get started in broadcasting?
I had gone to the University of Maryland to be a teacher because they had a wonderful early childhood program, and that's what I was sure I wanted to do. And I volunteered at the Faculty Daycare Center in my first semester and knew this was not what I wanted to do. I've always had great affection for and respect for the teaching profession, and that confirmed for me how hard the job was. So I actually came home and I took a semester off and I worked, and I went to the University of Delaware, which is where I'm from, and took a course, Introduction to Communication. I had always been an avid news watcher, not as much a reader when I was younger, although I read our local newspaper because it came every day. And I read periodicals, but I wasn't reading, papers from all over the country and things like that. But when I was coming up in Wilmington, Delaware, we watched Philadelphia news. And one of the first women anchors, Jessica Savage, was on one of the Philadelphia stations. And a very well-known journalist, Cassie Mackin, got her beginning in Philadelphia TV journalism as well. So I saw these two women in a role that I'd never seen women in before. And what impressed me about it, as I reflect on it, when the men were out in the field or having these various experiences, I didn't connect with that. Somehow when I saw a woman have these experiences of traveling and interviewing the mayor, and I thought, wow, that is so interesting. Wouldn't that be great to be able to know your community and learn about so many different things? And so I'm taking Introduction to Communication, and I said, well, this is where I belong. I mean, it's everything I love. It's writing, it's speaking, it's storytelling, it's research. I loved everything about it, and I really didn't know if I'd end up in sales or advertising at that point. So I got a job at the college radio station in sales. My dad encouraged me to go there in that route because he was a salesman. And one day I walk into the television station at the the radio station at the University of Delaware, and they said, oh, thank God you're here. Here, take this. And they ripped something off a wire machine and said, we're on in 2 minutes. Can you just read it? Nobody showed up to do the news. And I said, well, I don't know how to do the news. And they said, no, just read this. It's okay. And Harry, I have no idea what the story was. I don't know if it was national, international, local. I was scared to death. They flipped the switch. The red light came on. I read the story, and they had told me beforehand, just sign off with your name, and thank you very much. So I signed off with my name, and I just went, whew.
Wow.
And they said to me, well, you're pretty good at that. And I said, no, I'm here to do sales. And they said, we really would like you to come and think about doing the news. So I came in for a training session, and they told me how to get an actuarial. I had no idea what that was. What they meant by that was I was going to do an interview with somebody over the telephone, and they called that an actuarial. And that would be part of my radio report. And I thought, wow, okay. So one of the first people I had to call was the mayor of Newark, Delaware. And he took my call. And I was all in. I was all in. I could not believe that the mayor of Newark, Delaware would talk to a 19-year-old girl.
So right then and there you switched your career goal.
That's correct. I knew then that I wanted to go with the journalism route.
This was before Mary Tyler Moore?
It was at the same time.
Same time.
Okay. It was at the same time. Yes, it was. And, reading so much about Mary Tyler Moore in the wake of her death, I never knew the issue to wear pants. All of that seemed so normal when I was watching it on TV. It never occurred to me that wasn't appropriate. And I still remember, this happened twice at Channel 4. I would get calls and somebody would ask me what the time was in Australia or in Bangkok or something. And I would say, well, I really don't know. And they would say, well, just look at one of those clocks on the wall. So people really did think that Mary Tyler Moore was real.
Yeah.
And I was pleased that I never had to work with the Ted Baxter. I worked with a lot of people with a lot of credibility like Mary had. And I did not, from my management at Channel 4, ever encounter any kind of sexism, if you will.
And in fairness, I guess there are very few Ted Baxters.
I think there are very few Ted Baxters, yes. But he made for a fabulous TV character. And so my journey really began with getting thrown into doing a radio news broadcast and discovering that I could have access to the elected officials and to so many interesting people, and that my job was to tell their stories on behalf of the community.
And that led you to change your major.
Changed my major to journalism. And then the University of Delaware had a winter term. And during that term, the public station, which is actually licensed to Delaware but mainly operates in Philadelphia, but it has a little tiny studio, and they did a Delaware news show every night that about 5 people watched. But nonetheless, that was the local option. They came and helped us put on our winter term TV. So for 3 weeks, and I auditioned, and I was the anchor. And we, during that time, also brought in some Philadelphia television journalists to tell us about how you get into the business. And what I heard in those interviews and those workshops we did was, you've got to have an internship. So I went to the dean and I said, so where do we have an internship? And he said, well, we don't have an internship program. And I said, well, can I start one? And he said, sure. So I went, I didn't have the guts to go to Philadelphia and ask if I could do one there. So I went to the little Delaware television station, and they were like, oh my gosh, this is manna from heaven, right? So they said, absolutely. So I
never had an intern.
Never had an intern. So the first thing they did, the news director taught me how to write, and I have to say that was the most valuable lesson I had, more so than my college courses, was having to write under that deadline of a daily newscast. And I was writing news, and then the weather person got sick. And they said, well, could you just do the weather? I said, I don't know anything about the weather. And once again, they took it off the wire service, and in those days, instead of the magic markers that George was using, we literally had a felt board, like kindergartners. So you would say, oh, it's a sunny day, and you would stick a sun up on the board. And so the very first weather broadcast that I did, the felt didn't stick. And the sun fell down. And I laughed, and I put it back up, and I went on with the weather. And I remember the news director later saying, you're a natural. You should do this. You're very good at this, and we want to help you. So how would you like to produce a series and report a series on a local issue? And it was actually on funding for the fire department. And they weren't used to women, and at that point I was very much a young lady.
Needless to say, there were no female firefighters.
There were certainly no female firefighters. So I was 20 at this stage, so I was just out of being a girl, but those gentlemen could not have been nicer to me. I rode with them, and I had one of the producers from the television station help me, and we did a 5-part series, which became my resume tape, along with the anchoring that I had done during Delaware winter term. And then when it was time to look for a job, I created a resume, and I had my picture in the corner. And I remember my dean saying, I really don't think that's wise to put your picture in the corner. And I said, why is that? And he said, well, you certainly don't want to suggest that you should get a job based on your looks. And I said, well, I'm on television. I'm applying for jobs in television. And I said, I just think it might be helpful to me and might distinguish my resume if I can't afford to send tapes to everybody. I only can afford to buy 4. I said, so I'm going to send them something, and I had self-addressed postcards and stamped, and if they wanted to see a tape, they could send it to me. And that was, I thought I was going to make it as easy as I could for a potential employer. And I had many people tell me thank you for the picture and for the postcard. So my dean was wrong. And my dean had been wrong about not having an intern program. And so sometimes you've got to take a little initiative.
Yeah.
And I think that I learned that early on. And then Channel 4, and actually Channel 12 when I first started there and became the first weekday female anchor in Jacksonville, I had no idea, honestly, that I was taking so much initiative until I look back. And I think that's really something that, to me, it just sort of fell into place.
So you were applying for jobs out of college.
Yes.
And the Channel 12 ended up being that job.
Yes, and actually I had 2 interviews in Jacksonville, Channel 17 and Channel 12, no bites from Channel 4. And I had interviews, Channel 17 was interested, but they weren't interested in flying me here. I could come on my own if I wanted to. Channel 12 flew me here. And my ethics said that I would only speak to Channel 12 because it was unfair to go to Channel 17 on their nickel. So I never did talk to Channel 17. I drove to a station in Salisbury, Maryland, which was near my home, which had offered to give me an interview. And then a station in Bangor, Maine, said if I'd like to fly up, they'd do an interview. But only Channel 12 offered to fly me down. And I got off the plane, and there was a palm tree, and I said, yeah, this is going to work.
Had you ever been to Florida?
Once, only once, Cocoa Beach. When I was a high school student with my best friend's family, we made the drive, from Delaware. So we drove through Jacksonville. And so I had an idea, I knew where it was because of that one trip, but outside of spending, a spring break at Cocoa Beach, I'd never been to Florida.
So they offered you a job and you became a reporter.
I became a reporter, and my first literally weeks on the job, the education reporter had to leave for a family emergency. And in those days, women at Channel 12 covered women's issues, which were considered sort of the social issues and education. And so this reporter left, and I was the newbie. And they said, well, you're going to cover education now. And I was like, okay. So the teachers union was threatening a strike, and there were organizers coming in from all over the country, and the collective bargaining sessions, which this is how I learned about the Florida Sunshine Law.
This would have been about what?
This was
year?
1976.
Okay.
1976. So I knew so little about what I was doing that I attended every collective bargaining session in addition to working full-time. So if they went to midnight and I had to be at work at 8, I just thought, I have to learn this. And it was the earliest days of live television. The stations had just gotten their live trucks, and so they were very anxious to use
So
them.
you could do remotes.
So you could do remotes. So they threw me in front of a live camera, and it didn't occur to me to be scared or to not know what to do, because it was I had only been doing this job a couple of weeks. So I ended up being live most every night while there were demonstrations and reporting on the collective bargaining negotiations. And one of my earliest memories of covering that whole process was an evening story I was working on, and the anchor from Channel 4, Tom Wills, came up to me and he said, "Hi, I want to introduce myself. I want to tell you I've been very impressed with your reporting, and I want to ask for your help because I think you know more about this than anybody else." And he said, would you sort of tell me what the lay of the land is here, because I haven't covered this before. And I said, sure. And that was my first encounter with Tom Wills.
Or anyone else at Channel 4, I guess.
No, I had been on other stories, and Marlene Schneider and Bill Baxter. There were definitely reporters that I followed, and they followed me. And Bill Baxter actually asked me on a date once. That didn't work out because I was already dating David Heald.
Okay. And were there other women in the newsroom at Channel 12?
Yes, Sharon McClama was the other woman in the newsroom, and then the woman that I ended up covering for never came back to the station, and honestly, her name was Tony something, I can't really remember now.
Yeah.
But literally one other woman, and then at Channel 4 was Marlene Schneider, who was extremely well known in the community. And Marlene got to cover City Hall. And that was huge because that was considered a man's role. And so
she was the first.
And she was the
Channel
first.
4.
Yes. And that told me something about the management at Channel 4, and I had done my homework, so I knew it was a Washington Post station, and I knew that Kay Graham run the Washington Post. And I figured that might have something to do with it.
Indeed. And the next chapter is Channel 4.
The next chapter is Channel 4.
You ended up at Channel 4. Tell us how that happened.
When I was at Channel 12, I met my now husband of nearly 40 years, my first day on the job. And David was a reporter, and we were soon dating. And then he got a scholarship to go to school in London. Mm-hmm. And he asked me to marry him. Actually, as he tells it, I asked him to marry me because I didn't want to be apart from him for a year. He didn't want to be apart from me for a year. I said to him, well, there is one way to cover this problem. And so we decided to get married, and got married in 2-3 months' time. My mother was frantic because I was the first girl in the first wedding, but she did a great job. Mm-hmm. And so we lived in London for a year, and during that time I worked for UPI, United Press International, which of course doesn't exist anymore, as a radio reporter.
While he went to school.
Mm-hmm. And I actually was on American television a couple of times, my voice, not my face, because the independent television network at that time was looking for an American voice to do their stories from London. So it was pretty cool. I got to cover Margaret Thatcher's election as a voice. And I never got to meet her or go to anything, but it was pretty cool that I got that I got that experience. And we were probably early spring of that year, and we got a telephone call in London from Channel 4 that they would like to talk to me about coming back and working at Channel 4, actually to both David and I. And I said, well, we're not going to be back in the States until the end of the scholarship, which was late in the summer. So they said, well, we'll come to you. So sure enough, the general manager and news director flew to London. General Manager Amy McCombs, one of the first women general managers in the country, mm-hmm. and they took us to the Ritz for tea, which is not an experience I had ever had. And I'll never forget it because I thought, what do you wear to the Ritz for tea? And we talked about them offering us both jobs, and so that wasn't what was in our plan at all. We had put all of our stuff in Jacksonville in storage, thinking, well, we'll probably never come back to Jacksonville again. We'll just get the stuff wherever we go. So that offer made me want to talk to my Channel 12 general manager who had been so good to me. Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, when I left Channel 12 to marry David, the station actually gave me a bonus, and I was breaking a contract. And I thought that was pretty fantastic. Mm-hmm. So I tried to reach Gert Schmidt, and he was actually on a cruise. And in those days, you couldn't make a telephone call to a boat in the middle of an ocean. So I could not reach Gert. Yeah. And when the station got wind of the fact that I was going to be talking with Channel 4, their news director then called me, and the news director had changed, so I didn't even know the players, really. Literally in a year's time, things had changed. And as it turned out, as we were trying to negotiate with Channel 4, we ended up coming home for a wedding that we didn't know about at the time. And so Channel 12 met us at the Philadelphia airport and interviewed us in a hotel. And I'll never forget it, because I had been the anchor there. Channel 4 made it very clear that I would be anchoring with Tom Wills, and that we would be co-anchors, that we would be equal in all regards. When I went to the interview with Channel 12, they made it clear that I would be what they called the sub-anchor. Now, I had previously been a co-anchor. So it really wasn't hard. It really wasn't hard. And there was a big headline in the newspaper here, I remember, about, bidding war between the stations. And I laugh about that because I literally think the difference in the offer was maybe $1,000. There really was not a bidding war. And when I finally then, Gert was home, and I was able to call my former general manager, and he actually said to me, look, for your career, the opportunity to work for Channel 4, I completely understand. He said, the station has a magnificent reputation, and I think it's in your best interest. Again, gracious, gracious man.
Yeah.
So is there any doubt why I love this community? I mean, these were my earliest experiences. I met my husband here. I had a phenomenal boss who literally, I sat across from Gert Schmidt when I had worked as an anchor for 1 year, and I was 22 years old, and they were bringing in a new anchor man, and I read his salary in the paper. And I went to my boss and I said, well, why is he going to make twice what I make? And he said, well, he is married with 5 children.
This is right out of the MTM episode with Lou Grant and Mary Richards.
Honest to goodness, honest to goodness. And
All right, we roll.
I can probably just Google it now and find out, Gosh. Well, when I had been made anchor at Channel 12, I had a 1-year contract, and I'm sure it was because they thought, well, this is pretty risky putting this 22-year-old on the air as a main anchor. So my contract was up. And at the same time, they were bringing in a new anchor man. And I read in the newspaper what they were going to pay my co-anchor. So when I sat down to talk to my boss, he made me an offer which was a big raise. It was like from $12,000 a year to $15,000 a year, a very big raise. But I had read what my co-anchor was making, and it was 3 times that. So I went to my boss and I said, we're doing the same job. Why is he making so much more money? And Gert Schmidt said, well, he is a married man with 5 children and a lot of experience in the business. And I said to him, well, I get the experience part, I absolutely believe in. And I said, but I took one business course at my father's urging, and it was called personnel. And I learned something in that course, which is that you pay people for their job performance, and that it doesn't matter, it shouldn't matter, what their family situation is, their living arrangements, their faith, their anything else. You pay for job performance. And I said, I think we do the same job.
And this exact episode was, America saw this when Mary Tyler Moore went in to complain about her salary.
And now that you mention that, I'm wondering, had Gert seen that episode? But he literally leaned back
If
in
he
his
did, he didn't
chair.
learn anything from it.
Well, except he leaned back in his chair and he said, you're right. And he doubled what he
Oh.
was going to pay me. And I did think, I still believe that experience warrants more money. I don't think there's any question about that. You know, the Malcolm Gladwell and the 10,000 hours of practice, there's really something to that, I think. And so that really enabled me to start buying a wardrobe. I mean, I couldn't afford any of those things before. So it was a really a terrific experience to have my first boss be really so gracious and so open-minded and so fair.
So you did go to work at Channel 4.
I did go to work at Channel 4.
And it became a kind of legendary, unlike a lot of television that we know about, an anchor team that was together for a long, long time.
We were, when I retired, the longest running anchor team in American television history.
Which included Tom.
Which included Tom
Wills, George
Wood, and Sam Kovaris.
Yep.
Sam came the year after me, and I'm pretty sure that record holds because the industry had changed so dramatically that the likelihood of 4 people being together past that time, I think, is very slim.
And in those days, Channel 4 was still doing what it became famous for in the 60s, maybe late 50s, investigative journalism. and responsible in large part for some important changes in Jacksonville.
Channel 4, we did documentaries for many, many years, and we had in our ethic that our job was to hold our elected officials accountable to the people they serve. And we were all expected to know what was going on in all the meetings at City Hall and all the authorities, JEA, JTA, certainly the school board, which was really my bailiwick. Although I was hired at Channel 4 to be an anchor, it was always important to me that I remain a reporter. And I can actually remember saying once, you know, no news happens in newsrooms. And if you're not out talking to people in the community, I never wanted to be out of touch in that way. And so Channel 4 really enabled me to do that, and I appreciated it because I never wanted to just, and I was very good in live environments, and you could put me live in the field, and that happened a lot. But some of the most remarkable opportunities that I had were obviously somewhere else, from being on the USS Saratoga in the run-up to the war, a remarkable experience. Some of the reporting that I did on desegregation of schools, which allowed me to travel throughout the Southeast. The hurricane documentary that Tom and I did, you know, you think about the hurricanes today, it's get your materials, and but we really did an investigation of what happens when people don't leave. And we went and to communities that had been devastated by hurricanes. This was before Hurricane Andrew, of course. And then I was able to cover that. So most of what I remember about my time with Channel 4 was encouragement to push the envelope, to be very well informed about what was happening in your community, our state, and our world. We covered the legislature regularly. And always a sense that we were all peers, and that we were equally responsible to our community and to one another. It was a very nurturing and demanding environment to work in.
Would you attribute some of that gutsy journalism to the Washington Post ownership?
I don't think there is any doubt that the Washington Post ownership, I mean, I was growing up as a journalist in the days of Watergate. Obviously, the Washington Post was known throughout the country and the world for the tenacity at which they held our government accountable. And I don't think there's any question that that influenced the way we saw our role, and particularly around government corruption. Ernie Mastriani was a big part of that in the Channel 4 days. And I think that knowing that we were part of that gave us an awful lot of pride.
And I guess one of the things that would be interesting to think about is the fact that there was still ratings dominance.
Absolutely.
Things were going to change in a little while because there was going to be cable and so forth, but there was ratings dominance, and yet the station was willing to take on some things that might have been inherently unpopular in the racial area.
Correct.
And some other things that we could mention.
And we lost a couple advertisers, as I recall,
Yeah.
even in my era, because we published stories and that were not popular with certain corporations. But the station had the courage to do that, and I think that was really important.
So we can assume the viewers didn't retaliate about something unpopular by not watching.
That's right.
Because
That's right.
The ratings were
Because
still
the
there.
ratings continued. And I really do think people recognize authenticity when they see it. And I think Channel 4 was very authentic always, and still is.
Anything, any stories or issues that you might think of that I think race was a big issue. Desegregation of schools, all those kinds of issues that related directly to the racial dynamics of the South.
And I think too, Harry, that one of the things I learned at Channel 4 was to be compassionate in all situations. And so, for example, when the USS Stark was hit in a missile attack, and it was based out of Jacksonville. Our news director at the time called us all in and said, no one is going out to Mayport to try to interview people to find out if they had anyone on the Stark. We knew 37 men had died. He said, as soon as we get those names and we know who the deceased are, we will then come up with a plan to offer those people an opportunity to talk about the lives that were lost. And after that meeting, he called me into his office and he said, when we get the names, I want you to call the widows.
Always one of the more difficult assignments, to
Oh
go
my.
and interview
I said-
survivors.
And even to call, I said, Mel, I don't know how to do that. He said, look, they know you, they trust you. Many of these people are going to want to talk about the service that their husband, their dad, their father, their brother, their uncle gave to this country. And he said, it's our obligation to give them that opportunity. And when he put it in that context, and I had to nervously dial those phones, and to a person, I had the most remarkable experience of people being so grateful that we called. Some didn't want to talk, but some did. We sent condolence notes to everyone. It was a really difficult but very meaningful experience. Another time I remember was the GMAC massacre. You know, today in America, sadly, mass shootings have become routine. But that was a rare occurrence, and there were 8 people who were killed that day. And as fate would have it, the entire management of the station was not here. They were on their way to a Washington Post retreat. I believe they were on a bus going to Hilton Head. And so those of us who were left, we had to make a decision about how we were going to cover this.
Again, communications then and now.
And now, exactly. When they finally got to their destination and heard what happened, of course, they wanted to know, what are your plans? And they guided us, and we said, well, we're gonna have to expand the newscast. And the idea was to go to an hour instead of a half hour. And our news director, Steve Wasserman, said, I want you to do 90 minutes. I want you to start at 5, and I want you to go to 6:30. And Tom Wills was not here. Rob Sweeting sat in for Tom, and we dispatched reporters with police. We had psychologists come into the newsroom for live interviews. We thought of so many aspects of that horrible crime, how from the community perspective, the family perspective, the corporate perspective, obviously the police, the medical institutions, but how does a community grieve in this circumstance? And we had no scripts, and so we were live just with the producers telling us in our ear, okay, we're going to go now to such and such reporter with this. And so Rob and I did the 90 minutes. And I thought our coverage was compassionate, truthful, non-alarmist. It was an alarming story. We didn't need to add any intensity to that. And I was so proud of everyone. And I remember after the newscast, because I knew the station was thinking about expanding the news beyond the 6 o'clock. And I remember saying, folks, get ready, we're going to 90 minutes.
Yeah.
And that's what happened.
You would have been at Channel 4 during the historic license challenge.
Oh, yes.
Any thing you remember about that was a difficult period of time?
A difficult period of time. We knew we were on the right side of the law, and we
But
knew
the political dynamics could change things.
the political dynamics could change things, but we knew that locally we probably had a lot of support, and we knew that we had attorneys in Washington working very hard to make sure that the Nixon administration was not able to withdraw the license. I remember thinking, well, this can't happen. This can't happen. And it very well could have. I just knew how this community felt about this station. I knew the integrity of the Washington Post Company. I don't think at that time I understood how really serious it was.
And the challenge was to keep on doing what you were doing and not be having any
And so
reaction.
I think the local management did a very good job of keeping us almost, like you do with your children when something is going terribly wrong. You want to stay focused on what you're doing now, and we did. We stayed focused on our jobs.
And you were at WJXT for 25 years?
Almost 25. Yeah, I came in October of 1979, and then left in May of 2004.
And let's talk a little bit about your post-broadcasting career.
Post-broadcasting, I discovered my voice. When you are a journalist, it's very important that I believe, that you remain very neutral. Even though I think the station certainly had a commitment to justice. I do not consider that partisan. I consider that American. Today, I think you could argue that people would argue it's a partisan issue. But the station was on the front lines with civil rights, with desegregation of schools. And to me, that was supporting human rights and justice, and I was proud to work for a station that did that. Because I had covered schools so extensively, my nonprofit work tended to be in the education arena, and I got very engaged in early learning with Episcopal Children's Services, and was on that board for 15 years and became chair of that board. And then when we had the recession and school budgets were cut so dramatically, I got engaged with a community group and was a founder of something called Save Duval Schools. That was an advocacy group that we worked for several years to try to get more funding, to try to get the legislature to back off on so many regulations that schools have. I mean, education is truly one of the most over-regulated industries in America, and the local control is often stripped away by the legislature's mandates. So we argued that a lot of dollars could be rediverted if home rule could have a say in how we use that money, instead of the legislature had requirements that you had to purchase new textbooks in certain subjects at certain years. No doubt, because the textbook industries have good lobbyists, and it was ludicrous. The year that we were eliminating music teachers from most schools, the district had to purchase new music books. Now, I don't think music changes dramatically from year to year, and you probably could have supplemented with a few things that were in those days practically available online, but no, they were buying new music books that sat there because there weren't music teachers in the schools. So I do think that some of the issues that we faced in my journalism career impacted heavily what I chose to do in my retirement, if you will. And then that job led to, it wasn't really a job, it was all volunteer, but I actually decided to run for state senate on an education platform. I did not win, but I became more and more associated with education advocacy, and particularly public school advocacy. And then that led to me becoming president and CEO of the Schultz Center for Teaching and Leadership. I'd been a board member for 6 years at that time. I was a chairman of the board, and I had covered the opening of the Schultz Center. And I remembered how different school teaching was after the Schultz Center opened. And I began to go and see the kind of instruction that teachers were getting, the way schools were working together. I remember doing a documentary, and I had some teachers cry to me that this is the hardest work they've ever done in their life. Then I had others tell me, I've never seen my children move like this.
For someone who doesn't know, tell us what that center.
The Schultz Center was, it's named after Fred Schultz, who was a true city father and community leader.
And education was one of his big causes.
Education was what Fred thought was essential for our economic prosperity and for our community to develop a culture of learning. We had been a blue-collar town. We were one of the last big cities to get a university. And Fred thought that if we were going to really prosper, the best way to do that was to have a reputation of having the best teachers in the country. This came out of a community effort in the late 90s called the New Century Commission on Education, which was really co-led by then Mayor Delaney and University President, UNF President Adam Herbert, along with our school board. And it was a remarkable effort, and I remember covering it as a reporter. And out of that came several recommendations. Adam Herbert was very smart in tapping community leaders to lead committees on certain key subject areas. And he put Fred in charge of teacher development. And the university then provided all the research to the committees that were working on this and to the community at large. And Fred had an aha moment when he read that the greatest single in-school factor in student achievement is the quality of the teacher.
Yeah.
It's really not the school board and the superintendent. And it's really not the principal.
Despite what they may think.
Exactly, and their job is to support and to make sure that every child has a high-quality teacher in the classroom. So Fred learned that most professional development was not very effective at giving teachers the support they needed throughout their career, particularly as information and technology was changing so rapidly, as our standards kept going up and we expect more out of kids now. People will complain about our schools, but the reality is kids are doing now in 4th grade what I did in 7th. And I applaud some of it, and I vehemently disagree with the push down into pre-K and kindergarten of testing and away from a play-centered, exploratory kind of learning. But the good comes with the bad, right? So
you've had an enjoyable and challenging post-broadcasting career.
Yes. Very challenging. I've never led a nonprofit. I'd never managed people. And when you lead a nonprofit, you manage up to your board and you manage down. And I won't say which is easier, but I'll leave you to guess. So yes, I've had a lot of growth since I retired from television. And having a voice and giving your opinion was very liberating for me. I don't think I recognized how important it is to truly be who you are. And I always thought of myself as being authentic on television. I was my true self, and one of the things I'm proudest of about when I think back of the way Tom and I worked together as such a team, if he were to say to me, or I were to say to him as we were writing our scripts for the newscast, "Can I say this?" We knew we couldn't. We checked each other all the time, and particularly around education issues. I would say, "Can I say this?" And I would read my script and Tom would go. And it was such a great check and balance because we took out emotional language. We made sure we were speaking clearly based on evidence and that we had well-represented stories. And one of the other things I really remember about reporting with Channel 4 was there's this tendency when you're with the assignment desk is your job is to fill up those hours, right? So your job is, okay, here, this just happened today, go get the other side, right? Go get the other side and come back and put the story on the air.
Now that your connection with broadcasting is as a viewer, not as a broadcaster, what are your thoughts about what's good, what's bad nowadays compared to the maybe good old days?
The 24/7 news cycle and the social media environment changed everything. It changed it while I was working. in the business, and it's changing it every day.
Even more so, right?
And audience splintering. It is alarming to me when I talk to people who are in the business today, and when young interns come in and want to work, and you say to them, so where do you get your news? And their answer is my Twitter feed.
And we never heard the term fake news before, did we?
Never heard the term fake news. I can remember one of our news directors, when he did interviews with prospective reporters, his first question was always, what are the last 3 books you read and why? Do you know how many people were stumped by that question? A lot of people were stumped by that question. Now, he didn't care if the book was you read to your child or it was a textbook in school, but that you think in terms of depth. And 140 characters is not the way you learn about the news.
Indeed. You must have occasion, maybe in your new role and as a former broadcaster, to talk to young people who are considering what kind of career they want. What would you say to them about a broadcasting career?
I've been asked this question very recently, actually, and what I said was, you have to love to learn, and you have to be innately curious. You are not going to make a lot of money, particularly initially. So if money is your driver, this is probably not the career for you. And recognize that at least initially, you're going to be covering a lot of yellow tape, because that is, in this instant world we live in, the easiest thing to cover and to fill that time up is to show up at a crime scene. And a lot of what you're going to have to do to learn about your community, you're going to have to do on your own time. And I look back and I think, is that so different from, I did the collective bargaining sessions on my own time. I used to take weekends when I was a new reporter, and I would get in my car and I would just drive, because I knew that Jacksonville was the largest city and landmass, in the country, and I would just drive and see where it took me, and I landed up in different neighborhoods, and I just wanted to know what was out there. When George was talking about be careful on the west side, there's a tornado warning, I wanted to know what that meant. I wanted to be able to visualize the homes and the schools, and to understand where people were. I think that to be in journalism today, you really have to be committed to knowing the truth. And it's not about being on TV. It never has been about being on TV.
And also, I don't want to fail to mention your family, an important part of your life.
Absolutely.
So update us on David and your children.
Well, my husband David is the light, the love of my life, my best friend. I think one of the most wonderful things about David is he demonstrated how to be a man with integrity to my daughter and my son. That a good marriage, a good relationship, people support the other to be who they are. And he supported me. A lot of people that we knew socially would say, I don't know how you can live with her. She's not home at night, you're bathing the kids, you're reading the stories. And there was no mold for that. We had no role models, and we figured it out. And so David is just a first-class human being. And so I think that's one of the reasons my kids are too. So my son John and his wife Christy live in Tampa, and they have our 2-year-old granddaughter Vivian. And then my daughter Laura is 30 and lives here in Jacksonville. She went into journalism, which surprised me. She had started off in political science at the University of Florida. And John went into the Marine Corps after a business degree at Florida and served 4 years. Came out actually 5 years as a captain. He served 2 tours in Iraq. He is now in commercial real estate. And with Laura, she went into the University of Florida, all Gators, 3 generations back, except for me. And she called me her second semester, sophomore year, and said, you know, I'm already in like level 300 level classes in political science, and I'm doing well, but I don't think this is what I want to do with my life. And I said, well, that's fine. You know, you don't have to pick a major that leads to a job necessarily if you're interested in it. She goes, well, I just don't think this is where I want to be. I said, okay, so sign up for a class that interests you, anything. It's just an elective. She went into college with a lot of credits. She was an IB student, so she had that luxury. So she took a photography class. And she had always been our family photographer. From the time she was a little girl, when she was 11, she started doing all our family videos on vacation. And the first roll of film she ever took was with her brother's Fisher-Price camera. She was 4. And you know, you used to have to go to Eckerd's and have it developed, right? It's such a
quaint idea.
Such a quaint idea. And I'll never forget the day I picked up the envelope of those 12 pictures. You know, you had the little Kodak roll of 12. Right. And every one of them was framed. She was 4. I didn't know how she did that. But she just had this eye. She was a natural athlete as well. And, you know, natural athletes have eyes in the back of the head. They always know the position of the ball on the field. They always know the position of the teammates. So Laura took a photography class, and then she calls me, and she says, well, my photography teacher has said he thinks he can get me a scholarship to go to Berlin this summer on a trip he always takes. And I was like, great, Laura, that's really cool. So she went on the photography trip, and then she started taking advantage of everything that a great, big, and wonderful university like the University of Florida offers. So she went to all of the speeches and workshops and everything offered outside of class time. She met a Sports Illustrated photographer during that time. And on her way back from Berlin, she's in Kennedy Airport, and she says to her photography professor, isn't that Bill Frakes who came to speak to us from Sports Illustrated? She was a big sports fan, so she had known his work even before he came to the school. He said, yeah, that's him. So Laura went up and said, hi, I went to your workshop, and, you know, and he said, oh, that's nice. And, you know, she was telling him she was a new photography student, and he said, well, actually, I'm going to be in the market for a new assistant in the next 6 months or so. So if you know anybody graduating, tell them to come and see me. So Laura said, okay. So then, lo and behold, they, in Atlanta, they realize they're walking to the same airplane. And they're both going to Jacksonville, so they start talking about that. And then they get off, and they're getting their luggage, and Laura goes, why are you covering something in Jacksonville? He goes, no, actually, I live here.
Oh, wow.
And Laura said, really? Well, you know what you said about an assistant? I'd like to be your assistant. And he said, well, you just told me you just took one course. And she goes, I'm a really fast learner. So he called her that summer to literally be a grunt, to carry, and you can only imagine a guy, I mean, you can imagine the camera gear. My little 110-pound daughter, who's strong, carried it through summer heat for 12 and 14 hours at a time. And they've since formed their own company. She worked a lot for ESPN when he was with Sports Illustrated when he was a Sports Illustrated, and now they do a lot of work with ESPN, and they also have their own company, and they do work around the world. So it's ended up being really something, following your dream.
Well, is there anything that you would like to say that I haven't asked you about?
Journalism, it's interesting, Harry, as I contemplate what retirement looks like long term. You know, I always see myself engaged. And so even the periods when I wasn't working for a living, I was working at what I cared about. And storytelling and having the privilege of having other people tell you their stories is one of the great gifts of my life. And I think in some capacity, I will always engage in storytelling somehow. I don't know what that looks like, but it's really come home to me recently how privileged I have been to hear so many people's stories. One of the most rewarding comments I ever received was after I did a documentary about West Riverside Elementary School and the challenges they were going through to bring that school up in the Florida grading system through using, you know, standards-based education and really just reinventing the way students and teachers engage during a classroom day. The teacher in front of the classroom with the blackboard and then sitting behind her desk, it's gone. But that's when it started to shift. And I saw teachers struggle with it. We no longer accepted that every class would have a bell curve of students. We wanted every child to grow. And when you think about that, when you think about the attack that educators and public education has been under for so many years, and then you look that we are narrowing the achievement gap and the graduation rate is going up, that is because of great teaching. That's why. And so I'm covering that story was really exciting for me. I actually took time off from work. I produced it with my own company, and Channel 4 aired the documentary. And when we had the premiere, I had one of the teachers come up to me with tears in her eyes afterward, and she said, "Thank you. You told our story. We didn't even know what it was." And I said, no, you told your story. You told your story. You did know what it was. It's just that nobody ever asked you.
Deborah Gianoulis, thank you very much.
Thank you, Harry.